TIL The United States military invaded Canada in 1812. U.S. lost. Sensationalized title. Canada did not exist as an independent country back then. A better title would be, the U.S. invaded the British colony of Canada in 1812. Which is even less than a minor footnote in history, as the Napoleonic Wars were raging across Europe at this time, in which Britain was directly involved in, and much more concerned with. A minor skirmish in North America was not even worth the breath in mentioning during a year that saw Napoleon, at the height of his power, invade Russia. The better tale here is that because the forces that invaded Canada were primarily untrained militiamen, and failed so miserably, it showed that we needed to do away with using militiamen and instead create a professional and trained fighting force that could be activated when needed, comprised of volunteers. Though some form of National Guard has existed basically forever, this was when it really took shape and started to resemble the National Guard we have today. Canada became a stronger nation after this, with Métis, Indigenous, Irish, Germans, Scottish, and French fought without British support and defeated the invading U.S. force of the Chateauguay. This invasion was pushed by Governor Harrison Henry Harrison, Indiana Territorial Governor from the state of Indiana, who was an experienced and supremacist. An interesting side note is that in Charles Dickens' travelogue American Notes 1842, he mentions the memorial to General Isaac Brooke, who was slain on the point of victory against the American invaders, which stood upon the heights of the escarpment near to Niagara-on-the-Lake. His description of the forlorn state of this great monument only 30 years after its erection spurred the populace to stump up the funds needed to repair it, dedicated it to a great Canadian. I always disliked this kind of Canadian history. There was no Canada in 1812. The French colony of Canada was split up into two colonies, the province of Upper Canada and the province of Lower Canada, Upper being mostly modern Toronto and Southern Ontario, and Lower being mostly modern Quebec and Northern Ontario. The U.S. invaded the province Upper Canada and was repelled by a British militia stationed there and Indigenous militias under British command. Don't tell Americans that! They think they won, although they invaded Canada, got pushed back to New Orleans, where the war reduced to grabbing alligators, powdering their behinds, and somehow shooting another round. While the Brits were chasing the Americans, they burnt Washington to the ground. Then they turned around and went home, and somehow Americans think they won because the Brits, not yet Canadians, allowed them to keep a piece of Arcadia. I would argue the US won. We entered to stop press ganging, and we stopped the press ganging. Just because we didn't get Canada bonus prize doesn't mean we didn't win. Some also like to forget that the British torched the capital because they were being asked politely to leave and didn't want to leave anything behind. By that standard, the French won their war with Russia. Also obligatory mention of the Battle of New Orleans. The United States assumed the conquest was so certain there was almost no preparation. Most of our generals got the job from knowing people and were frankly incompetent. When US troops were about to cross into Canada, a lot of militiamen who had been called to service refused to cross the border, saying it was wrong, or at least that they weren't about to risk their lives invading another country. The US made a practice of invading nearby countries, especially if they share a border. British Canada, Mexico more than once, Indian nations, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Colombia, Nicaragua, the Confederacy. Also Hawaii, which was pretty far. British Canada did better than the rest, and they were barely trying. Britain was busy with Napoleon. We kinda got our asses handed to us too, you know, with the whole burning down the White House part and the sacking of our nation's capital. Very much the alright. We'll call it a draw energy. And in 2012, then Prime Minister of Canada Stephen Harper invited President Obama to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. Obama was May. On a more serious note, the War of 1812 defined Canadian identity. And the war is hardly mentioned or taught in US history lessons. Selective memory. It's amazing the mental gymnastics the jingoists go through to pretend that the US didn't lose the war. The demarcation is fairly simple. The US invaded, not 1 millimeter of Canadian soil became a part of the US. The White House got burned instead. That is not even a draw. Canadians, British, we won the war because we burned down the White House. Americans, we won the war because it established our sovereignty to the great powers of the world. The actual terms of the Treaty of Ghent, we're all just going to pretend this whole thing never happened. Did the US ever win a war? Fighting guys and camels in Iraq doesn't count. Any other war they have won? Oh, and dropping nukes in civilian cities doesn't count either. And arriving at the end of World War II to collect the spoils and take home Nazi scientists also doesn't count. Perhaps a battle, but not that war. The terms of the treaty at the end favored the US slightly, upstate NY made the slight difference. Moreover, the reasons for the US going to war were agreed upon by the British. Still, it's sad and too bad it happened. I used to follow this Canadian comedy group until they made a song celebrating the war, and it bothered me in a way I didn't think possible. That was the start of me not liking Canada and realizing even if I don't like my country, I still am an American. This title misses a lot of context. Also great source, probably couldn't use most other places that talk about the War of 1812 between America and England because they've been posted before. Oh, op is a karma farm. Surprising, this is just a really poor account of the War of 1812. It doesn't mention DC, or New Orleans, which were hugely consequential. And before we get there, no, Canada did not burn down the White House. Those were British regulars. Also, fending off the US invasion created a sense of national unity in Canada, and they immediately tried to rebel against the British and declare independence. The British forcefully put down the rebellions in 1837 and 1838. Not a historian, but I was taught that the British were doing British things and pissed off the Americans. The Americans tried convincing the soon-to-be Canadians to join us, they refused, we invaded. It ended in a draw, Canadian here. It was pretty much a draw. Also that the British press gangs were raiding US ships near Canada and forcing them into Royal Navy service. The US would probably not have invaded without that provocation. There's a joke. Canadians are taught they won the War of 1812. Americans are taught they won the War of 1812. British aren't taught about the War of 1812 at all. Native Americans lost the War of 1812. Nah. America didn't really lose. The invasion was simply a distraction so a covert operations team could steal their high-security maple syrup recipe. Source: Canada was formed in 1867. The USA invaded the British colony of Upper Canada and the British troops routed them and drove them all the way back and burned the White House. The United States invaded Britain and then burned down the White House. The Dominion of Canada didn't exist till it became independent of Britain in 1982. Canada was formed in 1867. The USA invaded the British colony of Upper Canada and the British troops routed them and drove them all the way back and burned the White House. Ahem, I believe a portion of the White House was also burned down around this time period. Polite and tolerant in the streets, raging maple mousse in the sheets. It's not us lost, it's we lost. You're thinking of a different war. I'm betting all the marbles you're also United Statesian, or the joke falls flat. Are people really just now learning about the era of 1812 Lamau? I really hope Hop is either not American, or just learned about this in school. Lamau. My history teacher in 7th grade Loki told us we lost, but as an American citizen, he felt obligated to lie and say it was a draw. It was an unfortunate stalemate with Canadian Sims. The US won some of Canada territory at some point which they still own to this day. The only reason Alberta is still standing is because Canada is forced to refine the oil in the US and export it back into Canada. Thought it was Kentucky National Guard or something like that. And why National Guard refused to fight their relatives I also heard. Not only did America lose, we then went to DC and burnt the White House. But then you gave us some beer and we went away. How did you just learn about the War of 1812? It's basic history. And Canada as an entity did not exist at the time. A detailed history can be found here, via the arrogant worms. We learned about this in school, right before we learned that we invaded back and lit the Capitol building on fire. The Americans that fought near where I live were mostly just Kentucky volunteers looking for more free farmland. Worried about how many people just learned about the War of 1812. If you're not American or Canadian I get it. It's cool. In 2077, Canada will have been completely annexed by the US in a 5-year annexation effort. Americans invaded, Canada fought them off. I'm confused as to the semantics of how the Americans won. Why do you think they call it the White House? After we burned it down they had to whitewash it. Canadians also burned down the White House but no one really cares unless you are a Canadian. Let's count how many Americans are coping by saying it was the British. Canada, 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 USA, fire. This is about as historically accurate as saying the French invaded the US in 1753. Quick question: no American condenser who won the Battle of Lundy's Lane? Do people not know about the War of 1812? It's really not a till moment. Was a part of the UK at the time and they burned down the White House. Canada wasn't a country until 1867. The war was with Great Britain. Damn right they did. Canucks won. Well, PS don't invade us PLS. That's nothing. Us Aussies went to war against emus. and lost. Those maple chugging fucks burned down our White House. I remember it well. We set fire to your now White House. Fake this what the liberal media wants you to believe.